Thank you so much, Patricia. And thank you to Joe for being here. It's just wonderful that you're in Asheville. And I'm sorry that we're not all actually sitting together in that beautiful room at Malaprops, but we are in spirit and we welcome you to Asheville. And I'm very excited to get to talk about your debut novel. And
Thank you.
hope everyone can see this really clearly. It's also a wonderful cover, I think. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later too, an intriguing cover. So Joe and I had a great conversation this afternoon about our conversation tonight. And one of the things that we agreed is that we won't spoil any plot because this is a very plotted novel, and it is in part an homage to a very plotted novel, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And we're going to discuss that a little as well. But I'd like to just start by, without spoiling anything, just naming a few of the big themes in Furnace Creek and asking you to unpack them a little bit for us. And I actually want to start because it's so interesting that you have set a Southern Gothic novel set mainly in the 60s and 70s within the framework of Dickens' Great Expectations. And what an interesting project that must have been to work on. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit first about how this book came to be and whether Great Expectations came first in your thoughts about this, or whether you started this book and then imbued it with Great Expectations. I think everyone would find that very interesting.
Okay, that's a terrific question, Elizabeth. Before I answer, I'd just like to thank the bookstore too. It's wonderful to be here in Asheville and revisit Malaprops and to have Elizabeth engage in this conversation. Well, now it's a continuing conversation since we've gone at it for an hour already about my novel as well as her own marvelous work. So thanks to all and all you people who have tuned in here. It's really nice to know that virtual works sometimes. The origins of this novel are many, but make sense as I go into the various strands that came together and what's really a rather serendipitous or coincidental pattern. I was yearning to turn away from my scholarly writing to fiction, one of my early loves, something I'd done all the way up to college years. Then I went off to grad school and started writing scholarship because that's what one does to get tenure and make it through all those hoops. Actually, it's with one of the audience members, my brother Ben, that we conceived this musical version of Con Man based on a Herman Melville novel that got my creative juices flowing again. I finally achieved full professor. I felt like I could start to run with the things I really wanted to do rather than be told what I had to do. And it was right after I finished chairing the department that I really wanted to get back into novel writing, a kind of thing I'd experimented with early on in my teenage years and college years. I'm just going to let a few more people in there. And, but I didn't have an idea in mind. It was just, my head was fomenting with, well, what to do. I want to do something that does have some sort of historicity, connects to the world that I knew growing up. And lo and behold, it was my parents' I think 50th wedding anniversary. And we boys staged it in Roanoke, Virginia, where they met and courted. And as part of that trip, we went back to the little town of Rocky Mount, Virginia, where I was born before we moved to North Carolina, and where my father grew up and where he and mom first lived. And one of the sites we visited and touring around Little Rocky Mount that weekend was a Civil War relic, a furnace that used to smelt bullets on Furnace Creek. That's a real place. And I just had this moment as we were going through the underbrush to get there, of remembering when I was a 5 and 6-year-old, when I would wander over from the Robinsons' backyard, some kids that I was friends with, and we would play at Furnace Creek and would try to crawl up on the furnace. It was too large for us to do, but it was like this really haunted, interesting fortress-like thing. And so in revisiting that site, at my parents' 50th anniversary, I just had one of those moments of like, gosh, some novel has to involve this. This is just the perfect setting for some kind of scene. So Monday, I go back to USC to teach my courses. And in one course, I'm teaching Zadie Smith's On Beauty, which for those of you who haven't read it, is her 21st century retelling of E.M. Forster's Howard's End, a novel published in 1910. And of course, everyone's amazed at the virtuosity with which she transposes story set into England, onto New England, and substitutes the working class sort of conflicts underlying Forster's novel with the racial context that pertain to the biracial family that she's dramatizing in On Beauty. So I had that in mind of, oh, here's someone who's just done this wonderful transformation. It's what Michael Cunningham also did, of course, with Virginia Woolf and the Hours. And my next class, 19th century fiction class, I was teaching Great Expectations. And so it was like really a eureka moment that, oh, a modern day version of the graveyard scene in chapter 1 of Great Expectations, where Pip is accosted by a criminal who literally turns his life upside down, might happen at Furnace Creek, where that Civil War relic would serve as a signifier for this traumatic yet transformative moment in my character's life, just as the graveyard does for Pip. So that's when it all came together. I was starting to think, and so I started thinking, what if Dickens' Pip had grown up in the American South that I knew in the 1960s and 70s? So that was the genesis right there. And then from that moment, I thought the first scene is here at Furnace Creek. And then my mind started spinning with the Dickens tin plate, the coming of age story he tells there. But of course, and this is, will lead to other questions. Of course, your imagination exceeds the boundary of any template. And before you know it, you're doing all sorts of other things. But it was that importation of the Dickens story that got me going. I needed that as a launching point, which was triggering all these memories as I saw the real Furnace Creek.
I think that's such a wonderful tale you just told too, of the generative power of teaching literature. A.S. Byatt talks about that too, and how you really, the works you teach, inside out. And I'm sure that was, so I just have to ask you, how many times did you reread Great Expectations while you were working on this book? How did you handle it?
Yeah, well, actually, I only reread it, I think, once, for specifically for thinking about the novel, because I wanted it to sink in, and I made lots of notes, but I didn't want it to overpower my own imagination. But that said, I probably read the novel 10 times, 8 times at least. The first serious time was a high schooler, like many of us. It was an assigned reading. It was part of our 9th grade high school collected literary works, all in one volume. And I think it was an expurgated version. It certainly used stills from the David Lean film version to try to entice our interest in this story. And I liked it because I was a good boy and a good student and liked thinking I was reading important books. But, most of us were groaning our way through the classroom. And so I think a lot of people's memories of Great Expectations is that, that's sort of a kids to teenager book, because that's when we first read it. Well, when I reread it, studying for my PhD exams, it was like a revelation to realize what a mature novel this is. And then when I reread it, I think this is when I was teaching at Harvard, around 84, it was even more like I was approaching my 40s, I guess, and it's or at least well into my 30s. And even, yet again, I thought, boy, this novel is really, it should be for adults only in some sense. It's about such deep traumas and sadomasochistic impulses and the demons that haunt us, that you know, my experience of the novel has enriched over time. And so I always tell my students when I assign it now, please reread it in another 15 years. It will seem like another book.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there are few novels, including Great Expectations and Middlemarch would be another in my mind, and Anna
Mhm.
Karenina also, that are totally different every 10 years of our lives as readers. And that's really interesting that you were so, it really sounds like it really kind of soaked into you from a pretty early age. And I remember reading it in college. I didn't tell you this afternoon, but one thing I think we forget about Great Expectations is how funny it is. And I
Mhm.
remember not being able to read it in the quiet reading room of the library because I would start laughing, and, to the point where you kind of have to pull your nose and mop your eyes. And that's one thing I really liked in Furnace Creek, that there is a very, there are a lot of very painful, difficult themes in it, but there's a very wry sense of humor throughout it too. And also, I thought it was powerful that you began with this Civil War site.
Mhm.
You certainly located in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, but we immediately have this traumatic past of the Civil War in the picture, literally from the first page, in a kind
Mhm.
of irreverent way, which maybe we shouldn't spoil for our audience yet. Do you have a passage you'd like to read to kind of share with us the tone of the book as it gets going?
Sure. What I'll do, I think, is read, it's a condensed version of the first couple of pages, just to give the flavor of Newt's first, well, it's not his first encounter at Furnace Creek, but the moment at which his life changes while he's playing there. My character is named Newt. He's a 13-year-old. Much more, much Pip in Great Expectations is a mere 6. My character is filled with adolescent hormonal turbulence, shall we say. So it makes for a quite different sort of moment of solitude, which adds both to the humor and the horror. Things that I do try to balance throughout the novel. It's something that Dickens is an expert in. We laugh a lot, especially at group scenes and the way he satirizes society, but there's always this painful undernote to most of the things that go on. And as for the Civil War setting here that will become important, it was, it just seemed self-evident to me that if I were writing about the South in this period, that racial issues would be first and foremost. That would be one of my additions to the sort of Dickensian template. And a lot of the blurbers on the book talk about it as American Gothic. And at first the term threw me, because I think of Gothic as Victorian Gothic, usually with the supernatural and castles and things like that. But in fact, the term is very apt for a whole strain of 20th century Southern writing that we call Gothic, I think, not only because the houses are all crumbling down, all these old mansions in decay, but because the South is haunted by its ghosts, which are the ghosts of the past. They're not literal ghosts, but it's very specifically the Civil War and its aftermath that I think is the not quite repressed ghost that's always escaping from the subconscious of anyone who's been raised in the South. Enough said. This will be just a few minutes here. My first chapter is called Bad Day at Furnace Creek. It's not quite a giveaway, but I think my last chapter may be titled A Perfect Day at Furnace Creek. That might be ironic. You have to read to find out if there's much difference between a bad day and a perfect day. For years, I didn't realize why it was called Furnace Creek, even though I've been discovering bullets in the vicinity ever since I was old enough to explore the creek on my own. The bullets in question were misshapen slugs of Confederate vintage, buried in the flinty soil, scattered in the underbrush, and sometimes wedged between the rough-hewn slabs that made up the sides of that rocky mound built on the steep embankment overlooking the creek. That was the furnace, a towering outdoor stone oven in which molten lead had been shaped into the slugs we kids showed off whenever we unearthed them from the recesses 100 years later. It was one of the countless Civil War relics that haunted the mountains and valleys of Franklin County, reminders of a cause that long since vanquished, stubbornly refused to vanish. But to my young fancy, the blackened furnace, hidden in the woods on the edge of town, looked more Egyptian than Confederate. It loomed in my childish imagination as a four-sided pyramid whose top had been whacked off 12 feet above ground. And whacking off was the fine art I learned there the summer of 1965, lying prone on those grim rocks as Furnace Creek, taking its name from this landmark, churned and chortled through the forested landscape surrounding my perch. And that initial onslaught of adolescence, as I was coming into my first and most vivid impressions of a world lying in wait just beyond the horizons of my vision, I had found a haven for my solitary vice, so recently learned and so eagerly cultivated on top of that old relic. Stretched out on its summit and hidden by a shroud of greenery, visible only to unquiet jays hopping from branch to branch overhead, I found a refuge from the domestic surveillance that attended every creaking bed spring or locked bathroom door in my parents' well-regulated house. Here, dappled in the sunlight that purified the act, whose pleasure even then was obscurely related to the guilty suspicion that I ought not to be doing, but I so obviously wanted to do, I learned to bring myself to delirium with strokes as sensuous as those summer hours of daylight were long. How vividly I still remember the day I first came into a sense of my place in the world. My place, that is something more culpable than a 13-year-old boy whose greatest misdeeds to date had been neglecting his nightly prayers. I was lying atop the furnace on that particularly blazing and humid July afternoon, shirtless, and the elastic waistband of my shorts pushed down to my knees. My vision had gone white from staring at the sun straight overhead. And just as my pent-up labors verged on completion, a dark fist bore down on my chest. A rasping voice demanded, "Give me your name, boy, quick." And my world turned upside down. I levitated in shock. The very instant, a loop of liquid unspooled from deep in my gut and splattered the hand that clasped down so fiercely on my chest. Before I had time to react to the strong fingers pinioning me in place, the interloper had climbed higher up the mound till she, for I now saw that it was a she, a powerfully built woman sweating even more mightily than myself as she gasped for breath, loomed over me, eclipsing the overhead sun. So intent was she on fixing me with her stare that she didn't notice, or at least notice enough to care, the milky ribbon coating her walnut brown fingers and spectacularly shaped vermilion painted nails. "You're the C-word boy. I know you." At the instant she identified me, I recognized her. Zithra Jackson Brown, the next door maid till last year. "Well, I'll be Baba Jesus," she said, and I don't think I was imagining the gloating sound in her voice, broken by wheezing gasps as she tried to catch her breath. "Here I am looking for a place to squirrel away, and what do I find? Newt see where the deacon's boy, abusing himself like he ain't never heard tell the wages of sin. It'd be a pity, Lord save your soul, if word got out on how you've been wasting your seed. At which point she registered the inopportune moment at which it interrupted my raptures by wiping her soiled hand on the shapeless blue smock she wore, at which point Newt then sees the words emblazoned on the smock, which are Franklin County Correctional Center for Women. So he suddenly knows he's in the vicinity of a convict. I was too terrified to reply. As her free hand ground my shoulder blade into the sharp rock surface, Zithra Jackson Brown smiled, a gold-capped smile that was anything but friendly. Uneasily, I watched a beam of calculation light her knowing eyes. And it would be a crying shame if folks was to hear how you forced poor old Zithra to partake of your bad habits, wouldn't it now? You daren't. Oh, yes, I dare say I would. And it ain't the only shameful thing old Zithra knows about you. Oh, yes, Mr. Goody Two Shoes, I done seen into your bedroom window when you and your friends. Whereupon she leaned forward and hissed into my ear her version of the despicable action espied from her observation post on our neighbor's second floor on an afternoon I'd conveniently erased from memory. I swear to God, the world is about to learn all the evils you've been up to unless you do exactly as I tell you. The fruits of her surveillance petrified me. All I could do was blurt out, "What do you want from me?" And Zithra proceeds to tell the boy exactly what she needs, using this bit of blackmail to get him to bring her a map that will help her escape from the county, some food, and a costume to change into, all of which she mandates the boy bring to her late in the evening before sunset. And she ends by telling the boy, "If you let me down, just watch me scream bloody murder to the world." Whereupon she squeezed a diabolical laugh whose low register seemed destined to call the high heavens into doubt. "Don't I know something about that, Mr. Nude? Things you never want to know." She laughed again, rasping for breath. Lord of mercy, what a day. I could hardly agree more as I took my departure, scrambling down the mound and tearing my way through the thorny foliage that surrounded that crumbling monument to a failed cause. Not too soon, the sound of her heavy breathing was lost in the slurps and trills of Furnace Creek as it coursed down its rocky bed, singing the same greedy song to which my forebears had cast unfriendly bullets in another world, another time. So that gives you a flavor of how Newt's adventures began when his world is turned upside down by Zithra at Furnace Creek.
Thank you, Joe. That's a vivid opening and great to hear out loud too. And of course, we know Dickens wrote a lot of his work to be read out loud. So this is a special kind of layer of that. So there's so much we could delve into here, but I want to ask you a kind of a craft question along the way, and that is a question that we all think about as authors, usually after the fact of writing a book. I'm wondering what for you as a writer was the most difficult aspect of writing this book?
Two things. One was simply reaching the point where I needed to break away from the model of, oh, if Dickens does this, then my character needs to do that. And reaching the point where the story began to tell itself and break free. But it took some time and experimentation to do that. The second other craft thing that was really a learning curve was paying homage to Dickens verbally. Like, I want to recreate some of his verbal rhythms. he has his own kind of lyricism that's not unlike a lot of Southern loquacious vernacular writing. So I wanted to draw those into proximity. But I found that I was also adopting a kind of Victorian novelist, sort of moralistic use of the first person retrospective voice, where anytime a scene would get a little too randy or raunchy, I would sort of back up into the distant long view where Newt would suddenly be looking back from 25 years on his past, rather being in the moment. And so one major rewrite was going through just eliminating a lot of those like moments where we realize our narrator is situated outside of the telling of the tale. And so I tried to hang into the really thorny parts of his experiences, because as a contemporary novelist, you can't shy away from a level of reality that even, well, someone like Dickens simply could not represent.
Although he might have liked to have that freedom from
Exactly.
we know about him now, and who knows, he might have read this with a sense of liberation. So that, I think that brings us directly into one of the other big themes. You've already introduced it with your reading, and that is that this is in many ways a book about desire. It's a book about sexuality and a very complicated person, narrator. And one of the things that you did, and I know we talked about this a little bit, and I think it's so important to the book, is that you took Dickens' character Estella, who is the kind of lodestar for Pip's desire and longing, and maybe we shouldn't spoil Great Expectations for people who are going to run out and read it right after this for the first time. I hope everybody is inspired to do that if they haven't already. But Estella is a powerful character in Great Expectations, and you made a very interesting choice to divide her into two characters, twins, brother and sister, both charismatic, glamorous, desirable people whom Newt is kind of caught between. So again, without giving too much of the great plot away, can you tell us a little bit about that decision to turn Estella into a brother and sister?
Well, I think part of it was simply wanting to put Newt in a position where he is exploring objects of attraction, doesn't have words or names for them, is a really smart kid, but still not smart enough necessarily to know who he is in a sexual sense. And the twins, as sort of split boy girl objects of maybe desire. He doesn't know what it is. He just knows he feels an immense attraction to them, allows a whole bunch of sort of more contemporary sort of explorations of sexuality to enter into the Dickensian world in a way that it couldn't have, again, back in mid 19th century. On a more global level, I guess, I just wanted to I guess, explore the ineffabilities of desire. That I agree with Dickens in some ways that, desire is that which is never attained. That's why it's called desire. But I wanted to not have the object of desire, as Stella, sort of just fixated, as happens in Dickens in some ways, into this one cold, frigid icon. And I wanted to make more palpable, because Estella's a really interesting character, but in the end, Dickens doesn't enter her consciousness enough to do, she remains too much a tool of Miss Havisham's manipulation. She is kind of the femme fatale, always distant. So I wanted to give sort of flesh and blood and materiality and backstories to these two twin avatars of Estella, to show how one could be as sexually manipulative or confused, or frozen in time and space as the twins in various ways are. I also wanted, and here again, I don't want to give away too much. My first scholarly book was on counter traditions in the love plot, ways that novelists, more experimental novelists, have always attempted to break out of the confines of the simple happy ending that so many Victorian novelists felt compelled to append to their novels, even if they didn't feel that it really sewed everything up, sort of a temporary halt. And so I wanted to create a novel about love and desire and romance, but without any of the strands necessarily resolving themselves. I wanted things to remain sort of open-ended to the very end.
And maybe we should acknowledge here that Hollywood, and therefore all of us in some way, we're still in thrall to that happy ending. So, and of course, your story of the twins and Newt and Desire is set against the background of the sexual revolution, which affects even Newt's own family in the 60s and 70s. Would you could you give us a little flavor of the twins and what they're like, and would you be able to read to us from a passage that would highlight them a little bit? I think they're wonderful characters and kind of intimidating, actually.
Yeah. What's happened is that Newt, when he's just about 16, he gets hired one summer by the town's eccentric bachelor figure, a character named Mr. Julian, who lives in this decaying, crumbling mansion. And he, if anything, is sort of like out of Southern Gothic and Truman Capote, I guess. And he hires Newt to arrange his library that's filled with thousands of books in disarray, which appeals to the nerd in Newt very much. So happens that summer, Mr. Julian has two wards, the twins who come to visit. They're 2 years older than Newt. They have been educated in boarding school abroad. They have all that sense of otherworldliness, the promise of something outside of Rocky Hill that Estella holds in great expectations for Pip. She becomes a lodestar not only for romantic desire for poor Pip, for always unfulfilled desire, but for the very plot of ambition, of striving to exceed what one might see as the limits of one's beginning point. So I'll read just an even shorter passage from a chapter called Savoir Faire and Then Some, where Newt, for the first time, meets the twins. Dev arrived a couple of days earlier for one reason or another, mostly because they're sleeping all the time. He hasn't been called forth to meet them, and he's afraid that with their presence in the house, Mr. Julian will have no time for him or their library project, and he'll just sort of fade into the woodwork. The following Wednesday opened a new chapter in my life. In my imagination, I'd have, of course, painted an unflattering picture of Mr. Julian's niece and nephew, and I fully expected to find them haughty, sophisticated, aloof. Haughty, sophisticated, aloof they proved to be. But what I hadn't expected was that they would also turn out to be irresistibly alluring, witty, and attractive, forcing me against the very fiber of my being to take note of their presence. Not that I caught a glimpse of either immediately. It wasn't until Wednesday that our meeting took place, the aforementioned Wednesday. And of course, it came when I was least ready for it. I'd been sorting papers in the basement since early morning, and when I came upstairs for more file folders, I was beginning to feel as smudged and earmarked as the duplicates I'd been filing away. Newton, Mr. Julian's voice arrested me on the threshold to the drawing room. First, I took in the flowery scent of oolong tea that hung in the air, a departure from Mr. Julian's Earl Grey, and then I saw them silhouetted by the light streaming in from the French doors. To the right of Mr. Julian's wheelchair, by the tea caddy, I registered the outline of a lithe girl, a young woman really, seated on the Duncan Fife sofa. She was dressed in a sleeveless sheath of a black dress with white panels running down the sides, very chic, very mod. My initial impression was that she was very pretty and very proud. To Mr. Julian's left, sprawled in an overstuffed chair, I made out the form of a young man, legs and finely tapered European trousers splayed before him with insouciance. Both lounged as if the room had been summoned into existence to gratify their wishes. Even though I could see the steam rising from the cups of tea they held, and even though the heat of the day was beginning to permeate the chamber through the open doors, they looked as if the air immediately surrounding them were 10 degrees cooler than anywhere else in all of Virginia. They were just that cool. My great niece, Mary Josephine, my great nephew, Marcus Joseph, Marky Joe and Mary Joe and Marky Joe to their familiars. This is Newt Stewart Seward, the local boy I was telling you about, so says Mr. Julian. I hovered self-consciously on the brink between rooms, aware of their eyes appraising me. I was just apologizing that I needed to cut through to the library when Mr. Julian stopped me short. Don't be daft, boy. Come introduce yourself like any civilized being. They won't bite. I stepped down and moved forward into the drawing room, feeling impossibly awkward. Extending my hand to Mary Jo, I noticed her eyes traveled down to my dusty fingers and bitten nails. I'd never felt more common in my life. To mask my confused feelings, I turned to Marky Joe. Drop the Joe, for heaven's sakes, just call me Marky, he said. As he appraised me, head to toe, I was suddenly aware of my dime store jeans, wrinkled t-shirt, and mud-stained high tops. I have to state the obvious now, at this place in my narrative, because even if I were too dazed to articulate it at that time, I know I felt the truth of what I have to say, and I know I felt it from the very first time I laid eyes on the two of them. The Sumner twins were the most handsome creatures I'd ever seen or imagined could exist. The imprint of their beauty existed not only in their stunning eyes, so nearly identical but for the color, not only in their perfectly straight noses and full lips, not only in the sheen of their nearly identical dark manes of hair, or in their perfect complexions, not only in the casual assurance with which their shapely bodies occupied space. It was not any of these things alone that constituted their beauty. It was the aura of self-possession and breeding that emanated from their good looks and filled the physical space between us with the two qualities most guaranteed to kindle my innermost desires, inevitability and impossibility. So we can see from this sort of initial encounter the degree to which poor Newt suddenly feels, oh, I'm the hired help here, the common boy, in face of these immensely glamorous people who at once become sort of what he wants to be in a way, as he sort of falls into a false sense of expectations and grandeur, and they become what he wants in a sense too, as objects of desire. But as objects of desire, on some level, they remain impossible. These distant beacons of what you might attain if you just try hard enough, which leads my character Newt into a maze of his own makings, of his own desirous ambitions, of his wish for something greater, something we all hold in common, and that's nothing wrong with that. But it's when we enter a dream world, a fantasy world of what that could be, that you can be led astray, which in various ways Mr. Julian and the twins create in Newt as he pursues the goal of his ambitions.
And we know that he's on a collision course, just like in different ways, but in a way like Pip in Great Expectations, he is on a collision course of desire. And you've talked a little bit about how you thought about endings, happy endings versus ambiguous endings versus tragic endings. And I think it's good to note here that Dickens wrote Great Expectations as a serial in the magazine all the year round. Is published, and he pretty much wrote it week to week, if I understand correctly, which must have been a very challenging task. And then it was published as a novel in 1861. So it was published as a serial in 1860 to 61. And then later in 1861, it was published as a novel with a different ending, right? So because the public protested the first ending. And so we won't give away endings here, but it is very interesting what kind of collision course you've set them all on. I want to make sure we have some time for questions from our audience. And I have been watching the chat. I don't know if I'm seeing them, but maybe Patricia or Stephanie could help us out. Oh wait, okay, we have a question here. Okay, and we've embarked on this. Would you talk some about the dual endings?
Okay. Well, again, I don't want to give away too much, but let's say that in Dickens, he wrote first an ending that's sort of the somber, like, this is how reality often really plays out after Pip sort of is deflated of all of his expectations and learns to lead a more reasonable, realistic, and sadder life. There was a public outcry, and so he wrote what the published novel contains, which is an ending that has a hopeful promise for him and Estella getting together. You don't know if it's getting together as friends or as lovers. It's left empty, so there's still some openness there, but at least there's a mitigated happiness, I would say. And I couldn't, at one point I toyed with the idea, how about if I had an appendix on my novel, just like appears in the current Penguin version of Dickens, where you get an alternate ending that's set in a little smaller type, like this is what the author originally intended and we found in his desk drawer, but since I didn't do it first, I couldn't really do that in all honesty. But what I've tried to do is plant throughout the novel intimations that, how to put it, that paths may diverge and go different ways. So for instance, Newt in high school is putting on a play his senior year. That's an adaptation of Hamlet, a sort of feminist version of Hamlet, where Ophelia is the main character. And for that play, he writes sort of a friend of his, a young girl, feminist-minded young girl, Miranda, sort of scolds him, saying, "Why do you have to have just a tragic or a happy end?" So for that, he sort of branches out. And there are many times where characters say, "Look at history and what's happening now. We don't know which way it's going to go. It's up to you." The way that things are going to tumble together and create future courses of action. And so in a postmodern spirit, I wanted to do some gesture toward that kind of openness. So the subtle reader will notice that the two last chapters are both titled chapter 37. That doesn't mean that either excludes the other, like in a Dickens case. I won't say anything more except that I hope that it expands the possibilities of even what a novel can do.
Yeah, I have to say I looked back and forth myself with that number a couple times And yeah, that's really a lot of fun, um, serious fun. So one thing this novel does is take an unexpected turn into a subplot that is an art history mystery. It's partly rooted in real history, but very much fictionalized, as I understand it. And it takes us also to some unexpected locations. And I'm wondering if and you know, you can tell I'm being canny about not spoiling surprises again, but I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your decision to include that sub mystery, which is very
Mhm.
different in a lot of ways from the rest of the book, and which is a vehicle for getting us to some other pretty interesting locations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. The last, I guess, third of Great Expectations involves a kind of detection plot in that Pip has to try to get his real benefactor, Magwitch, out of the country. And they're being chased by people, and it's a disaster and all sorts of stuff. So there's a little element of the thriller that enters his text. Mine's of a different valence, like you said, altogether, but I did want to shift into action on one level, simply because my character Newt has been, in many ways, a very passive recipient of other people's machinations up to this point. And because of various turns that his life has taken and decisions he's made, at this point, he's strong enough to take action himself. So I wanted him to be the active person in something that involved, real action, and provided a sense of that thrill of mystery, a plot unfolding. And I'd read in a National Geographic, I think, about the time that the artist Caravaggio spent on the island of, oh, I can't remember. No, it wasn't Sicily. I'll have to look it up again. But there's a missing like a year and a half in Caravaggio's life. And so that made me think about, well, what art might have he done then that hasn't been discovered yet? And so that becomes the catalyst for the sort of art plot that then I hook up. And this is, entirely my invention, but the character, Mr. Julian, the person who's hired Newton, is sort of like his mentor combination, wicked witch and wizard and fairy godfather all together. It involves his past, which also involves siblings who are lookalikes, and is set in Europe and involves the old world as well as the new world, and involves art in a way that's too complex to explain now. Art and inheritance, what gets passed on or doesn't, that falls through history's lacunae. And so that was an inspiration for what would make the European parts of the novel, set in Rome and Paris, a scene where Newt could really come of age and come into his adulthood by taking charge of events that are crucial to a number of people's lives and make it through to the other side.
Yeah. And, and we know that, I mean, one of the things that I think adds depth to that is that there was a lost Caravaggio painting. And you've probably read the wonderful nonfiction book, which is really kind of a page turner. I think it's called The Lost Painting. The Lost Painting. Anyway, it's Caravaggio. Maybe our hosts will find it, but it's a real life chase, hunt for a Caravaggio, and that decision to put a thriller piece into the plot, I think Dickens would have liked that a lot too. We know Bleak House is such a thriller too. We have a couple minutes left if anyone would like to pose another question. And I'm wondering, in the meantime, Joe, if there's anything that you can share with us about what you plan to do next. The terrible question everybody gets asked, but are you thinking about more fiction? Are you working on a scholarly book again, or some of each? And I know you have a book of short stories coming out, but beyond that, is there a new project for you?
Yeah, I definitely want to write another novel as soon as the inspiration strikes. Before I let myself do that, I want to finish my fourth monograph, which is called The Melville Effect. It's about 21st century manifestations of Melville across all the arts, from opera to performance art to novels that take up Melvillian characters or themes, sometimes even Melville themselves. I'm just asking the question, what's this obsession among many edgy contemporary artists working in multiple media, including digital media, with Melville, which has led me on many an interesting path. But that's winding up. I've done 3 or 4 chapters. So once I lay that to rest, I will tidy up the short story collection, which is very different from the novel, and then launch on my next novel.
Well, it'll be another fascinating story to hear what place and conjunction of circumstances trigger that novel. I can't wait to hear that. It
The one
sounds
thing, the one
yes.
thing I'll guarantee is that uh, no more turning to a predecessor text. I did that with the Con Man musical. I've done that with this novel. I'm out on my own now. I'm going to uh, dare to go without the armature of another structure getting me started.
Well, I think that sounds so exciting in itself, and I look forward to our future conversations about that. I have a picture of you launching a boat kind of away from Moby Dick out onto the sea. And I hope that the audience will go out and get this and enjoy it as much as I have. And I think that it really does bring a lot of different worlds, themes together, and in a contemporary way that is just full of wonderful surprises. So if we don't have any other questions, oh, I see we have The Lost Painting by
Oh,
Jonathan
good.
Harr. Yeah, a page turner, a nonfiction page turner about Caravaggio.
And
And yes, Joe.
yeah, I was just going to add, if you're in town, please go buy your copy at Malaprop, support our independent bookstores. Thank God, Asheville has several. Most places now have one left, but make sure that one, wherever you are, doesn't go under by supporting them when you can. And as all of us authors wish, spread the word. If you like a book, you know, make sure somebody else knows about it. And of course, we're going to be looking forward to Elizabeth's next book too. So keep that on your radar.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks for the reminder that we can use this book in every order to support our wonderful malaprops here. So I'd like to thank them, and also very much to thank you for sharing all this with us. And we hope you come back to Asheville as soon as possible with the next book. How about that?
I can't wait. Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you,
So much.
Malaprops. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. I really appreciate it.